When you find her, don't leave her alone. Marry her. Those were Elias Carter's last words, spoken with frost in his beard and blood in his lungs. The tent moaned in the wind like a ship lost at sea, its canvas heavy with snow and cold. Outside, cattle shifted and snorted against the storm, while riders cursed the wind that stung like needles through their coats. But inside, in the dim lantern light, Randy Mallister knelt beside the only friend he'd ever truly trusted. Wyoming Territory, late winter of 1879, just outside Silver Creek. The world was white and cruel, and so was death. Elias lay under a pile of wool and quilts, skin slick with fever sweat, his breath shallow and uneven. Randy leaned in close. Snowflakes slipped through the tent flap and melted on his collar. "Randy," Elias rasped. "You'll see her, in Silver Creek, Carol Dawson. Don't leave her alone. Marry her." Randy clenched his jaw. "You know I never planned to marry anyone." "I know, but she has no one. And she's braver than you think." Outside, a guy rope snapped. Inside, Elias shivered beneath the covers. Randy tucked the quilt tighter around his friend's chest, hands surprisingly gentle for a man known to wrestle bulls and break broncs. It was a strange thing sitting there beside death and realizing the debt owed wasn't measured in coin or cattle, but in memory. Elias had once saved Randy from drowning in a spring river when they were just boys. Now Randy was being asked to save someone else, and not just anyone. A woman he'd never met. "Who is she?" Randy asked. "Carol Dawson," Elias whispered. "Kansas-born. Can sew a seam in a storm. Writes with truth. Took the long road west because I told her there was a home at the end." Randy nodded slowly. He looked at the small bundle of Elias's things, a folded letter, a nickel watch, and a white handkerchief embroidered with a blue E. He wrapped them carefully in brown paper and tied them with a bootlace. "I will see her," he said at last. "I'll give her the truth. If she asks for my name beside hers, I'll place it there. If she needs a roof, I'll build it. If she needs silence, I'll keep it. This is my word." Elias closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. "That's enough," he murmured. "She deserves someone who doesn't flinch when the wind changes." "I don't flinch," Randy replied softly. But inside he felt something deeper than fear. A road stretching ahead, a future shaped by duty, not desire. The cook pushed the flap aside, eyes red from smoke. More hot water. They worked in silence, tending the fever, listening to the storm. Randy Mallister, 4 years old, foreman of the biggest cattle spread in 3 counties, was known for being a man of few words and fewer ties. Yet now, in a snowbound tent lit by dying light, he had given a vow stronger than rings or witnesses, and somewhere out there beyond the drifts and wind was a woman named Carol Dawson, a stranger he had just promised his life to. Before we ride into the next chapter, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your hometown in the comments. I'd truly like to know. Because these stories of the Old West, somehow they always find their way home. They expected a burden. What they got was a woman who made the wind seem polite. 2 weeks after the storm, the sun blazed down on Silver Creek's main street, turning dust to grit, and every wooden porch into a gathering place for whispers. Word had traveled ahead of the stagecoach. Randy Mallister, the rancher who barely spoke and never smiled, was going to meet the fiancée of his dead friend, and he had promised to marry her. They came to see the show. The blacksmith still in his apron, Mrs. Dobbins from the bakery flour on her sleeves. A few ranch hands leaned against the hitch rail, grinning like they were at a rodeo. Most expected someone pale, meek, maybe holding a single bag with both hands like a child left behind. Randy stood near the post, hat low, face unreadable. He hadn't said much since Elias died. He'd written Carol only once, short, respectful, explaining what had happened and where to meet him. He wasn't even sure if she'd come. But when the stagecoach pulled up in a cloud of dust, everything slowed. The first to step off was a traveling salesman in plaid. Then an older woman clutching a sleeping bundle. Then a gloved hand gripped the doorframe. The woman who stepped down wasn't anyone's idea of desperate. She stood tall in a dark green traveling dress, chestnut hair coiled neatly beneath a modest hat. A faint scar traced from her left cheekbone to her jaw, but it only sharpened her presence. Her eyes scanned the crowd, steady, unbothered. One man muttered, "Looks like she could stare down a grizzly." Another whispered, "That can't be her, can it?" She spotted Randy immediately. "Mr. Mallister," she said, voice clear. "I'm Carol Dawson." He tipped his hat. "Miss Dawson, my condolences for your loss." For a beat she said nothing. Then loud enough for the whole porch to hear, "Before we go any further, I need to ask if your promise to Elias was given only out of pity. I will refuse right here and now." The murmurs stopped. Even the horses shifted. Randy studied her. The firm set of her jaw. The way she stood straight despite every eye watching. This wasn't a woman come to beg. She was evaluating him. "You speak your mind," he said at last. "I do," she replied, unapologetic. A ranch hand chuckled behind them. Randy shot him a look sharp enough to cut the sound short. "If you're here to judge my sincerity," he said evenly, "we should speak somewhere less public." She nodded once. Agreed. Together they walked toward Murphy's General Store. She didn't cling to his arm. She didn't hang her head. She simply matched his stride each step, calm and measured. Inside the store, Randy led her to the back room, dusty, quiet, smelling faintly of coffee and kerosene. He shut the door behind them, shutting out the town and its whispers. She didn't sit. She didn't fidget. She folded her hands in front of her and met his gaze directly. "You wanted to speak privately," she said. "Now's your chance." And just like that, what began as a promise in a snowstorm had become a negotiation of equals. "If you expect a woman to fold into the corner of your house like a spare blanket, send me back on the next stage." The back room of Murphy's General Store was dim and quiet, with sunlight filtering through a dusty window high above the shelves. Randy Mallister removed his hat, set it carefully on a crate, and looked across at the woman who 10 minutes ago had publicly called him to account. Carol Dawson didn't lower her gaze. She stood tall, hands folded, composed, but not rigid. Her voice when she spoke was calm as a drawn line. "I didn't come for charity, Mr. Mallister. Elias and I exchanged letters for months. What he offered wasn't romance. It was respect, mutual benefit, a home I could contribute to. If that's still what's on the table, I'll hear it. If not, I'll take the next stage out." Randy leaned slightly against the edge of a barrel, arms crossed. "You think I mean to treat you like property?" "I don't know what you mean," she replied. "That's why I'm asking now." Her words weren't laced with anger, just clarity. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet refusal to be misunderstood. Most women would have clung to his coat. She laid down her terms like a man signing a land deed. Randy watched her for a long moment. Then simply, "And what do you expect?" "To be a partner," she answered. "Not an ornament, not a servant. I can work, I can earn, and I'll carry my weight, but I'll also keep a piece of independence. I need that." He studied her face, not the scar, but the steadiness in her eyes. You talk like someone who's been burned. The faintest flicker passed across her expression. She nodded. I had a seamstress shop in Kansas. Took me 4 years to build. One night a lantern fell during a storm. The fire gutted it in minutes. I got out with my life and this. She turned her head slightly, so the scar caught the light and nothing else. My family had already lost the farm. That shop was all I had left. Randy didn't look away, didn't flinch. So you agreed to marry Elias, yes. We understood each other. No false promises. He respected my past, and I respected his honesty. Silence settled between them again. It wasn't cold, it was thoughtful. Randy straightened. If we marry, you'll have a place at the ranch. You'll be safe. But I'll expect you to live there. This country's hard, and I won't have you alone in town. Carol tilted her head slightly. And in return, he said, you'll never be asked for more than you're willing to give. You'll have my word, my roof, and my respect. That's how I ride with any partner. Her eyes searched his, measured him. Then she nodded slowly. And I keep what I earn. That's your right. She exhaled once. Not relief, something steadier. Then we're agreed. A practical marriage. Respect, support. Nothing more than either of us wishes to give. He reached for his hat, settling it back on his head. We'll speak to Reverend Thompson tomorrow. Best do it quick before the town turns it into a soap opera. A hint of a smile touched her lips. They already have. There were no flowers, no kiss, no fluttering music. But sometimes what begins without spark burns the longest. The next afternoon, under a sky the color of bleached bone, Randy Mallister and Carol Dawson were married in the small clapboard church at the edge of Silver Creek. Only a handful attended. Mrs. Dobbins from the bakery still dusted in flour. Murphy from the general store. 2 of Randy's ranch hands who shifted awkwardly in clean shirts. And Reverend Thompson, who spoke the vows plainly, without sermon or sentiment. Carol wore the same dark green traveling dress she had arrived in. Its neat lines and clean seams were a quiet declaration, dignity over display. Randy stood beside her in a black vest and a freshly pressed shirt. His hat rested respectfully on the front pew. Do you promise to honor and keep one another in mutual respect? The Reverend asked. I do, Carol said, steady as stone. I do, Randy echoed, just as firm. They signed the register, shook hands. No kiss, no fanfare. Just 2 people keeping their word. It wasn't the kind of wedding that stirred hearts. But sometimes the heart stirs after the vows are spoken. At sundown, they returned to the boarding house. Mrs. Kowalski handed them the key with a wink. The bridal suite, she grinned. Carol merely nodded, unbothered. Inside the room was modest, 1 bed, a washstand, a single window catching the last of the light. Randy set down his saddlebag. I can take the chair, he offered, nodding toward the worn armchair near the table. Carol shook her head. You'd wake with a back like an old mule. I'll take the bed. You can make a pallet by the window. We've both slept colder places. He gave a small nod. Fair enough. They moved in silence, each unrolling their blankets, careful not to crowd. And though they now wore rings, simple bands of silver hammered by the town smith, the room felt more like a treaty than a honeymoon. Later that evening, Carol broke the quiet. Do you know if the town has need of a seamstress or maybe a sewing teacher? Randy looked up. You plan to work, I need purpose, and I prefer to earn my own money. He nodded again. We'll ask Murphy in the morning. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. That night, they slept in the same room, but worlds apart. There were no lingering glances, no whispered confessions, just the steady, breathing stillness of two people figuring out what it meant to build something from the ground up without the blueprint of love. Some women wielded rifles. Carol Dawson used a needle, and somehow she made it feel just as powerful. By the end of her first week as Mrs. Mallister, Carol had found her opportunity. Silver Creek didn't have a resident seamstress, just a traveling mender who came once a month when the weather allowed. The rest of the time, folks patched their own clothes with crooked stitches and mismatched buttons. Carol asked Murphy about the unused side room of the general store. Narrow, dusty, but it had a window and just enough space for a work table. The rent was more than she could manage alone. When she mentioned it to Randy, he nodded. If it suits you, take it. What she didn't know, what she suspected, but never confirmed, was that later that evening, Randy paid Murphy half the rent in advance. She's proud, he said. Let her think she's covering it all. It'll matter more to her that way. Murphy nodded. You married a strong one. Minnie Hook. She wasn't here to play the grateful wife. She was here to rebuild her name one hemline, one stitch, one boundary at a time. Carol cleaned the space, hung her tools in neat rows, and sewed curtains for the window herself. By the end of the week, the shop was ready. A simple sign in the window read, "Mending, alterations, lessons." Customers came slowly at first. A torn sleeve here, a wedding hem there. Some paid in coin. Others offered eggs or firewood. She accepted whatever was fair, and she never turned away a job. Word spread. By the third week, she had girls stopping by in the afternoon, curious, awkward, clumsy with a needle. Carol welcomed them without judgment. She sat among them, guiding their hands, correcting gently. You're not just learning to sew, she said one day over a length of calico. You're learning how to make sure you never have to ask a man for every coin in your pocket. Not everyone liked her. Some whispered behind her back about the scar, the quiet wedding, the fact that she spoke plainly and never asked for help. Others admired her, especially the women who had once felt invisible. Then came the test. One Saturday, Clay Dobson, half drunk and half proud, stumbled into the shop with a ripped vest. "Fix it," he grunted. "I'll pay you next month." Carol slid it back across the counter. "No credit, Mr. Dobson. You know my policy." "Don't be difficult," he smirked. "You can trust me." She didn't raise her voice, just met his eyes. "I don't do business on trust alone. Pay first or take it elsewhere." Silence. Dobson stared at her, then snatched the vest and stomped out. By sundown, the story had made its rounds. Some laughed. Others nodded in approval. Randy heard about it from Murphy before Carol mentioned it. That night, as he stopped by the shop to walk her home, he said, "You handled him well. It was nothing. It was enough." As they walked through the quiet street, boots clicking on boardwalk, he glanced over at her steady, unshaken self-made, and something deep in his chest settled. This was no burden. This was a woman building something bigger than a shop. She was building herself. If you've been following this story and admire the quiet strength of Carol Dawson, hit 1 in the comments. If you don't quite know how to feel, yet hit 0 and tell me why. I'd love to hear your thoughts. They didn't applaud her. They watched her. And slowly, grudgingly, they started to listen. After Clay Dobson left her shop empty-handed and red-faced, Carol Dawson's place in Silver Creek began to change not all at once, but like snow melting from a sunlit roof. Quiet, certain, impossible to ignore. She didn't boast. She didn't retaliate. She simply kept sewing. Every finished hem, every mended coat, every girl who learned to thread a needle under her guidance. They were stitches, not just in fabric, but in reputation. The townsfolk began to adjust their glances. Mrs. Parsons, once hesitant to make eye contact, started bringing over scraps of muslin and news from the bakery. A widowed rancher's daughter asked Carol how much she'd charge to teach her daughters not just sewing, but standing tall. And then came the alley. One bitter evening, as Carol was locking up the shop, she heard shouting behind Murphy's store. A man's voice angry, a woman's scared. She rounded the corner and saw Mrs. Ellen Parsons, cheek red and swelling, shrinking back from her husband, half drunk and fully cruel. "Go inside, Miss Dawson," Ellen pleaded. Carol didn't move. She stepped forward firm. "That's enough," she said. "You've made your point. Now leave her be." The man sneered. "Or what?" "You'll sew me a sermon." "No," she said calmly. "I'll fetch the sheriff, and the whole town can hear why." For a long moment he stared at her, then cursed, turned, and staggered into the night. Ellen clutched Carol's hands, trembling. "You shouldn't have done that." "But thank you." Carol nodded once. No one should be afraid in their own home. The next morning no one said it to her face. But Silver Creek's women looked at Carol differently, and the men looked twice before speaking sideways. She didn't change overnight. She didn't become beloved. But she became respected. And in a town like Silver Creek, that was rarer than love. Carol's shop started to fill not just with dresses and repairs, but with voices. Women came to learn to sew, but stayed to talk, to share, to ask. "My husband says I can't handle the accounts. Think you could show me how to keep a ledger? My girl's afraid of speaking in front of anyone. Could she help you in the shop, Carol?" What would you do if you had a chance to leave? Carol never claimed to have the answers. But she listened. And in that listening, she became more than a wife, or a widow, or a scarred woman with strong words. She became a quiet example. And Randy. He watched it all unfold. He never interfered, never puffed his chest. He simply made sure she got home safe, checked the locks on the door, and walked beside her without once stepping in front. At first he'd promised her safety. Now he was learning to give her space. And in that space, Carol was blooming. He'd promised to keep her safe. He never meant to let her in. Randy Mallister had always kept things simple. A man, a horse, a ranch, a job. Promises made, promises kept. But watching Carol Dawson take root in Silver Creek was anything but simple. She didn't just work. She transformed. With a needle in hand and quiet fire in her spine, she had turned a dusty side room into a place where people, especially women, came not just for clothing, but for clarity. Randy noticed the shifts before he understood them. She walked home taller. She spoke with fewer pauses. She laughed now, sometimes without apology. And then came the evening he saw her through the frost-streaked shop window, kneeling beside a ragged boy no older than 8, showing him how to tie a bright scrap of fabric around a carved wooden horse. Her hands moved gently, steady, sure. The boy smiled shyly. Carol smiled back, the kind that didn't reach her mouth so much as soften her whole face. Randy didn't go inside right away. He stood in the cold boots in snow, heart a little off its rhythm. He wasn't just proud of her. He was drawn. Duty had built the door, but something warmer, something unexpected, had opened it. Later that week, he walked her home like usual. The streets were quiet, the moon hung low, and the boardwalk creaked beneath their steps. "You handled Dobson well," he said suddenly. She glanced at him. "It wasn't anything." "It was," he said. "You didn't bend. You didn't shout. You just stood firm. That matters." She tilted her head, studying him. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," he said. "But I'm still learning who you are." She nodded, and for a few quiet blocks they said nothing more. But something between them had shifted, less measured, more natural. That night, lying in bed, him on his pallet by the window, her in the bed across the room, Randy stared at the ceiling, restless for the first time in years. This wasn't the arrangement he had expected. This wasn't the woman he'd pictured. This felt like something more. And when the saloon hand tried to block Carol's path a week later, slurring something about a woman that fine being wasted behind a sewing table, Randy didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped in, laid a hand on the man's shoulder, and said 4 words. "Go home. Now." The man muttered and left. Carol turned to him, blinking once. "You didn't have to do that so quietly," she said. "Most men would have made a scene." "Most men," Randy replied, "care more about being seen than stopping the trouble." "I'm not most men." She smiled. Small, real. And that night she thought not about the confrontation, but about how he didn't try to own the moment. He just made sure she was safe. The respect between them was no longer distant. It was close, familiar, and it was turning into something else. He had spoken vows out of loyalty, but tonight he'd speak for the first time because of love. The snow came early that year, covering Silver Creek in a soft, relentless white. The town grew quiet beneath its weight. Chimneys smoked. Doors stayed shut. And on Main Street, Carol's shop window glowed like a lantern in the fog. Randy had spent the day at the bank finalizing paperwork on a plot of land north of his fence. The numbers made sense. The timing was right. But even as he stamped the snow from his boots, he knew that wasn't why he'd walked back to town that evening. He passed the bakery, the saloon, Murphy's, and paused in front of her window. Inside, Carol was kneeling beside a bolt of deep blue fabric showing one of her students how to mark pleats with chalk. Her hands moved slowly, explaining each gesture. The girl nodded, trying to copy. Carol reached over and corrected her grip, not harsh, just present. Steady. Randy didn't knock. Not right away. He just watched her work. He had kept his promise. He'd married her, protected her, given her space. But somewhere along the way, what had started as obligation had turned into want. He'd said, "I do," when it was expected. Now he had to say something, because it mattered. He opened the door. The bell above gave a soft jingle. Carol looked up. "You're out early for a snow day," she said. "Bank meeting," he replied, brushing snow from his coat. "About the Morrison land." She nodded. "Good soil. You're thinking of buying?" "I was." He paused. "But that's not the only reason I came." Her brow lifted slightly. He stepped closer, voice low even. "Carol, this isn't about a promise anymore. It hasn't been for a while." She set the fabric aside, standing straight, eyes searching his. "I want you," he continued. "Not because Elias asked me, not because it made sense, but because somewhere in all this, the shop, the ranch, the nights walking you home, you became the person I look for first in the morning and last before I sleep." She didn't speak right away. The snow hissed softly against the window. Then, very gently, You have a strange sense of timing." He gave a sheepish smile. "Too late." She shook her head slow. "I've loved you for weeks, but I told myself to keep it quiet. We had an agreement, I remember," he said. "Respect, support. Nothing more than either of us wished to give." She stepped closer. "I'm wishing for more now." He took her in his arms. No hesitation, no ceremony, just a kiss that said finally. Outside Silver Creek lay hushed beneath the snow, but inside the quiet turned warm. They started as strangers became partners out of promise. Now they were builders of something neither had dared hope for. The kiss had changed something, but not everything. The next morning, Randy and Carol rose before dawn like always. She folded linens and sharpened scissors. He measured feed and checked fence lines. But as they passed each other at the table in the hallway on the porch, the silence between them was different now. Softer. Chosen. That Sunday, they sat at the kitchen table of the ranch house, coffee steaming beside a spread of maps, seed catalogs, and a half-finished ledger. "The north pasture is too dry for cattle," Carol said, tapping a spot with her pencil. "But it's flat enough for flax." Randy raised an eyebrow. "Flax? You can spin it into linen, sell it locally. No need to depend on rail shipments from St. Louis." She slid a folded page across to him. Her notes, neat, clear, practical, listed seed costs, harvest yields, potential weavers. He read in silence, then gave a single nod. He'd planned on buying land. She turned it into a living thing. They decided together 10 acres to start. A few of the ranch hands' wives were willing to learn. Carol promised to oversee planting and teach spinning to the younger girls once harvest came. The idea wasn't just good, it was new, and it was theirs. Over the following weeks, their days became intertwined. Randy invited her into ranch business, supply orders, cattle rotations, even bull selection. Carol, in turn, let him help at the shop, delivering fabric, building shelves, and once hemming a curtain under her watchful eye. He was clumsy with a needle, but she never laughed. Just guided his hands, patient and precise. In town, folks started to talk, not with suspicion this time, but with admiration. The woman with the scar had become something more than a curiosity. She was a business owner, a teacher, a rancher's equal. And Randy, the silent man of the hills, wasn't just her husband anymore. He was her partner. Together, they taught the town something it hadn't known it was missing. That marriage could be a collaboration. That work done side by side could feel like love. That quiet could hold more trust than 100 speeches. By the end of winter, the shop had a waiting list. The ranch was running leaner, smarter. And in the evenings, they shared quiet meals, reviewed numbers, or simply watched the snow fall without needing to speak. One evening after supper, Carol folded her ledger shut and looked at him across the table. "Do you ever think Elias knew Randy didn't answer right away?" He reached across and took her hand the way he always did now, without fanfare but with certainty. "He knew exactly what he was doing," he said. "He gave us both what we didn't know we needed. Some promises end with a handshake. Others are folded, tucked away, and kept beside the heart forever." The fire crackled low in the hearth of the ranch house, throwing flickers of gold across the wooden walls. Outside, snow drifted silently, wrapping the hills in stillness. Inside, Randy sat in the armchair by the fire, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching Carol breathe in sleep. She lay curled on her side beneath the quilt she'd sewn herself that first winter. Her hair was looser these days. Her hands, though calloused, never stopped moving. The scar on her cheek had faded to something barely noticed. To him, it had long since ceased to matter. It was part of her, like the way she said, when thinking, or how she counted stitches in her head before falling asleep. He rose quietly and crossed to the shelf by the window. There, inside a cedar box that once held cartridge shells, lay a bundle wrapped in brown paper and tied with an old bootlace. He untied it slowly. Inside was a folded white handkerchief. Neatly stitched in one corner was the single letter E in blue thread. It had been Elias's, the only real token Randy had carried with him from that snowbound tent all those months ago. The one thing Carol had never seen. Not because he meant to keep it from her, but because some debts aren't paid in words. He stepped quietly to the bedside table and placed the handkerchief there just beside the oil lamp she always turned on at dawn. Not for thanks. Not for memory. But for meaning. When she woke, she'd see it. And she'd know. He returned to the armchair, settled in, and watched the firelight reflect off the soft folds of fabric. It struck him then that love, real love, wasn't always something you confessed. Sometimes it was something you stayed for, something you showed, not with flowers or flourishes, but with fences mended, coffee brewed before sunrise, and handkerchiefs left by the firelight. By spring, the flax had begun to grow. The shop expanded into the back lot. The ranch hands' wives stitched patterns into linen that would soon become garments tablecloths trade. The town no longer called Carol the woman with the scar. They called her Carol Mallister. And Randy, he still said little, but when he did, he said only what mattered. So now I ask you, have you ever kept a promise so quietly no one even knew? Except the one it was meant for, tell me in the comments, just one line, one name, one gesture that stayed with you long after the moment passed. Because sometimes the smallest promises become the biggest stories. And out here in the West, we believe every story, especially the quiet ones, deserves to be heard. If this tale moved you, if it reminded you of love that came slow but stayed strong, type 1 below. If you're still not sure what to feel, that's okay too. Type 0 and tell me why. I'll be listening.